Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Ricardo Lopez with Lone Star Analysis, and I'm joined with,
James Rudlinger.
and we are going to talk today about 4 competitive intelligence best practices you can't afford to ignore. So, what we'll cover today is we'll go through some of the must-know competitive intelligence attributes, the 11 best practices that will improve your business strategy, and in so doing, we're going to touch on turning intelligence into actionable data and the benefits that come along with that, and effective ways and tips to leverage tools to stay ahead of the competition. As mentioned before, James and I are here. We are your presenters today. A little bit about Lone Star Analysis. We are a privately held company headquartered in Addison, Texas, a little over 100 employees, and we specialize in predictive and prescriptive analytics as well as evolved AI. Our entire focus is on helping our clients make smarter decisions faster. So let's talk about, before we get into the best practices, we're going to define competitive intelligence. And I think from so doing, we will hit all of the key points that we discussed earlier. So competitive intelligence is the process of legally and ethically sourcing and analyzing disaggregated data related to a rival company and turning it into relevant, accurate, and actionable knowledge. There's a lot to unpack there. And so, when we think about what is competitive intelligence, intelligence is not information. In here, it talks about legally and ethically sourcing. So one of the key points we want to talk about is, where do we get some of that data and how do I use it? What are some of the best practices? Analyzing disaggregated data and turning it into, that implies there's a process. So a lot of the best practices that we're going to discuss are going to be around, well, who are the right people, or what are the right behaviors? And what are some of the appropriate organizational level things that we need to do to be able to have this process work out effectively. And then the last part, as we mentioned, intelligence is not information. And so when we look at this, we want to look at it through the lens of what is relevant, accurate, and actionable. And in so doing, we can help increase our probability of winning a contract. And you'll see the quote down there below from the godfather himself of competitive intelligence, Ben Gilad: intelligence is a perspective on facts rather than the facts themselves. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go through.
And one thing I would add too that, Ricardo and I have seen as well, when we think about it, it's the tricky part is turning that information into the analysis or intelligence. And one of the key things that we see, and it's tough, whether some of y'all listening are an analyst yourself, you lead a team of analysts, or you're a stakeholder in CI, the analyst, the tough part is, what is that perspective, as Ben Gilad stated, or what is the analysis outside of the information that's there? And that's one of the critical pieces, is you want to stay independent, but as a CI analyst, as a stakeholder, you do have a role in that perspective and pooling all of the information together. And sometimes that's a tough line to follow that we'll kind of see as we go through this.
Yes, that's a great point. And so many of you who know me know how much I love dogs, and my 2 prize dogs, I have 4, but my 2 prizes are my bloodhounds. They're the most unique dogs we've ever had. And so I refer to them as nature CI analysts. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn from nature about what the best attributes are. And then James is going to talk about what some of the best practices are and how that applies to the world of competitive intelligence. So if you look at the bloodhound, you'll notice that they are built a certain way. They have a specific makeup. So they're very thick, sturdy legs. They've got really long, droopy ears. They have a lot of extra skin. So one of the things, that is important that we can take away is that they are built for the job, right? So when a bloodhound is tracking, the way that they track, you take a scent, so maybe a handkerchief, a piece of clothing, whatever, and you put it up to their nose. They take in that scent, and then they know what to look for. And they'll go off and track and track and track, and they won't stop until they find what they're looking for. So if we unpack that, being built for the job, that loose skin, when they put their head down, it blinds them. They cannot get distracted because they can't see anything that's going on around them. Those long ears, they operate like a vacuum or a broom. They sweep the scents up into their nose, right? You look at their nose, what they have in there 230 million olfactory cells. It's 40 times more sensitive, or they have 40 times more than a human, right? There's a lot of capacity there for detail. There's a lot more that they can take in. And you see the long neck and shoulders, they're built for it. So with that genetic makeup, okay, when they sweep that scent up, they exhibit one of the best attributes that we call focus. Okay, when they put the sense in there with all of those olfactory cells, they create an image in their mind that is way more detailed than anything that we could ever imagine. But to them, it's real. And so, right, that tells them, hey, what am I looking for? I can see it, I can visualize it, I can feel it, I can taste it. And again, like we said, once they get on that path, they don't divert off of that. They're driven. So one of the cool things about bloodhounds is they will not stop working until they find the prize. Okay, and so one of the longest data points that we found is 130 miles. A bloodhound going 130 miles until it finds its scent. Now, one of the things that they have to do is if they reach a dead end, they go back and start over and keep going and going and going. So, they're part of that being driven is they know they're going to run into obstacles, but it doesn't matter. They don't let that stop them. They follow, each thread until its logical end, and then they're accurate. I don't know if you guys know this, but a bloodhound's testimony is actually admissible as evidence in court. They've been proven to be extremely accurate in their results. And so, they can follow tracks that are old, 300 hours or more old, and, they can distinguish smells. For us, we can kind of smell when somebody's baking cookies. They can separate the smell of the chocolate chips from the flour, from the salt, from the sugar. They're that good. So that's nature CI analyst. James, how does this apply to an actual CI analyst?
Yeah, no, and kind of right in our little funny picture there. Essentially, we're trying to be a bloodhound, but in a competitive intelligence world. And what we're doing, that first point in terms of being focused, it's simplistic in nature, but it's critically important. And a lot of the times we can find ourselves even in competitive intelligence, right? If you have an idea of what you want and you go down the path of what you're looking for, you're trying to find it. But if you don't stop and almost like the bloodhound, what am I smelling? What's the scent that I'm looking for, and create a framework for that plan, then it's really easy to get off of the trail. And so what we're trying to do first from a CI best practice is, right, sometimes it takes a little bit of pre-research. So you may need to spend a day or two, maybe a week. Hey, what's the topic I'm looking for? What really matters? And get an understanding so that you can create a plan. It's not just create a plan with no knowledge, but get an idea of what's out there, create your plan so that you can focus on what are the key intelligence topics that I'm looking for. And then that's a helpful framework for, as you're researching, am I working towards the end goal that I designed in this framework? So just like the bloodhound, right? Am I going down the right path? I'm not diverting my attention. If I realize I'm not on the wrong trail, I go back to the framework that I set up or my plan, and then make sure that I'm focusing on information that's relevant and actionable. And part of the nature that goes into that, and why we use a bloodhound as an example, anyone listening who's been a CI analyst themselves or gone into the weeds, if you're not driven or dedicated, it's very easy to find out that competitive intelligence is not the field for you. Because there are some days where you're in the 30th page of Google search results, or you're on your 5th research paper that are each 50 pages a piece, and you found absolutely nothing. And the tough part is you have to be driven, because this process of discovery, you're marking all of those stones and saying, okay, I've turned this stone over. I've turned this stone over. And so even though you may not get the information you need, you're eliminating your sources and digging deeper to understand, where is that information that I'm looking for? What's beyond the surface? And so similar to the bloodhound, sometimes it takes you 130 miles to find the information that you need to make a competitive decision, right? If it was so open in the public and everything was well known, competitive intelligence wouldn't exist as a function for companies and for us as a third party to provide that to external stakeholders. And so it's tough, but it really is focusing and kind of channeling the bloodhound to say, I need to follow this thread to the conclusion. Even if I don't find anything, that's the process of discovery. I mark it, document it, move to the next source, move to the next place. And being built for the job, this one is kind of tough because I know Ricardo and I kind of have talked a lot about this. We don't mean being built for the job in terms of, hey, you can't do CI if you weren't born as a CI analyst, right? There's definitely training and there's ways to learn it. What we mean is right, there's certain characteristics in terms of, hey, you have to be critical. You have to treat everything for what it is. It's an input. And you have to be able to separate yourself from when you find a source and you find something, sometimes you want to run with it and say, this is the answer. But that's one data point. So, right, sometimes you have to try and prevent your own bias from taking place and be critical of what you're finding and not, try and seek with the end in mind. You have to be objective and make sure that, right, sometimes you find one data source and you go, great. And then you find a second article that has the same conclusion, a third article. But then when you follow the trail, you realize they're all referencing the same original interview with the CEO of a different company. So that data point that has multiple sources is really all the same source, just 3 different journalists wrote about it. So you have to be careful with what data points you're using. And right, it seems like you have multiple sources, but in reality, there's one single point of failure that you're looking at from that one interview that everything's based on. And so sometimes you have to go outside of just open domain research, right? Whether it's subject matter experts, it's connections that you have inside of the industry. This one is very hard to follow because when you have a connection in the industry or in the network or you're at a conference, you have to be very careful of what line that you're drawing to make sure that the information you're sourcing is ethical, you're representing yourself properly. But this is right, the human part of it, or the human intelligence, is where you can start to use those resources and start to gain information outside of traditional behind the computer screen research that you could be doing. One that's important to me, my background is in communication, so this is probably something I drill home all the time, but in CI, communication is probably one of the biggest factors in terms of being built for the job. A lot of the times, the accuracy is highly important, but for most stakeholders, it's the communication of how did you get to that conclusion? Because CI, it's always uncertain. We're always making an assumption of what's there. And so communicating how we came to those assumptions, what sources led us to that information, can help the critical stakeholders that we're trying to inform understand how we got there. Because sometimes our stakeholders have information that we may not be privy to. And so when we communicate it properly, we're not playing a gotcha game back and forth with a key stakeholder. We're playing a, hey, here's how I came to this conclusion. They may bring new information to light. We can incorporate that. And then kind of that last piece is connecting the dots. And that's kind of right. The bloodhound being built for the job, more genetically, for their standpoint, we think of it more as a perspective in terms of being built for the job and having these things in mind. And lastly, I said communication is highly important. It is still incredibly important to be accurate. And accuracy doesn't mean you're 100% right 100% of the time. What accuracy means is, right, is this relevant to the decision? Is this relevant to the stakeholder? Have you turned the information into something that's actionable? And right, intelligence has to be timely and it has to consider uncertainty. We're always predicting the future. We're making an assumption. So being able to properly explain or give reference to the uncertainty that's there and in the timely manner of things being time sensitive, because the information that was relevant even a month ago or a couple weeks ago may not be relevant anymore. If a company was acquired, your competitor that you're looking at could have completely changed, and now it's a completely different landscape. So it has to be timely. You have to make sure that's taken into account. Communicate the confidence in your data and conclusion. And again, I think we talked about it in some of the sources and being objective and being critical, but it's really easy to fall victim to misinformation, disinformation, or circular intelligence. And this is kind of that example of, hey, I have 3 data sources. But in reality, those 3 data sources are all from the same one piece of information. And so now you're kind of falling victim to a circular intelligence. And then again, you want to make sure with how much information can be in the public domain from individuals who don't go through a journalistic process where everything's edited, fact-checked, and put together, or even journalists with, maybe a biased perspective, depending on the source of information. Could be disinformation, could be misinformation. So making sure you find multiple points of data to support your conclusion is always important in order to help prevent that. And so that's kind of how we try and channel the bloodhound in order to be, apply it to competitive intelligence from our perspective and what we do in the field every day.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. And here at Lone Star, we have supported over 1,000 different engagements, and so between that and our subject matter expert pool of over 1,500, we have built these best practices over a number of years, and and a number of engagements and different perspectives and markets and all that stuff. And so what we're going to do is we're going to transition now. We've talked about the individual, the analyst. Let's talk a little bit higher level and go into what are some of the best practices that we've seen across the board. And so here are the top 11. I know there's a lot of data on here, so we'll go through as much detail as we can to give perspective. But these are just our viewpoint from what we've seen over time. So the first one, and to me the most important of all of them, is to build a strong culture of CI. One of the things that we have seen over all of the engagements that we have supported is that culture of CI is a bigger determining factor on whether or not the CI is perceived to have value and impact on the probability of win than anything else. And part of the reason is, if you look at some of these, we say have a winning versus a burdened mindset. Some organizations, they frame this as, I can't live without the competitive intelligence because it's what enables me to size up my competition and adjust my approach to beat them. Versus other organizations are, hey, listen, I just need to check the box. There's another thing I have to do. And so, building that strong culture, it requires a winning mindset, having an executive champion. We've seen organizations where they do have an executive level competitive intelligence, senior director, vice president type, or, vice president of competitive analysis, competitive analytics, things like that. Having that executive champion really brings credibility, to the practice. They've got a seat at the table. Awareness, right? Part of the culture is helping your folks tune into and always be listening for, the intel, the information that can be translated into insights. And as James mentioned before, legally and ethically, of course. A strong culture of CI also requires you to be, we talked about as an analyst being critical. Here, it's a fine line between being objectively critical and judgmental, right? Oftentimes, what I've heard in a past life is information is the currency of the kingdom. And so sometimes people hoard that information, or if their information is different than yours, it can be kind of an adversarial thing. And so for us, it's like, hey, look, a winning culture, a strong culture of CI says, I'm going to treat everything as an input, and I'm looking for the truth, not my truth, not James's truth, not somebody else's truth, but I'm looking for the truth, because in understanding the truth and the way things operate, then I can figure out how to, tune my approach to win. Being open-minded versus the gotcha game. That's another one that we've seen. Folks, winning cultures tend to, use the overused term, think outside the box, but they tend to push outside their own comfort zone and acknowledge, or at least be open to the possibility that maybe what they didn't think was possible could be possible, right? And willing to explore and understand what those things are. And then the last two are, creativity and being inquisitive. Sometimes, if you're within a certain industry, you could be the victim of your own experience, right? And if you're trying to branch out and grow or look for something innovative, a lot of times that innovation is not necessarily a new idea. It might just be a new idea to you. So we look to industry A or B where they operate a little bit differently than us. Oh, look, yeah, there's a unique thing that they've developed over there that can be used, in our thing. So that strong culture of CI, it's not something that you can put on paper and just say, okay, hey, we're going to do this. It has to be in the DNA. It has to be reinforced. We're gonna talk a little bit more at the end about the bookend to this, which is the sufficient and qualified resources to execute and build that culture. But that's first and foremost number one. You want to take number two, James?
Yeah, no, and again, everything in number one is important. So once you get the culture of CI and you make sure that, right, the organization and everyone's bought into what we're doing, why we're doing it, this is probably what Ricardo and I see is the number one obstacle to effective CI is you can buy a lot of things, but you can't buy time. And whether it's from external clients or internal clients, I'm sure everyone has been in it where, right, I need this tomorrow. Well, effective CI takes time. And so one of the key things that we preach, and it kind of goes into building that strong culture of CI, if you have the strong culture, you can really start to reinforce starting early. And that's why kind of the strong culture comes first. With CI, you need time to be able to understand who are the competitors, who is the customer, right? And then once you get that first cut of information, you need to test that, right, with other stakeholders or subject matter experts to say, hey, I've come to a conclusion. Let me run this by other stakeholders who have different perspectives and make sure, are there gaps? Do I have single data points of failure? Do I need to go through it? If you don't start early, you can't effectively get to that solution. And so every time that we've seen it, anything that's there, if we're on the government side, typically this is, oh, am I at the request for information? Is this at the draft request for proposal or the final RFP? It's okay if you don't have customer documents yet. Even on a new start program, you can start before that's in place so you can start understanding your customer, understanding how those documents may came out, what requirements are they looking for. So instead of responding to the request for information or the request for proposal, you're helping shape that with the customer from the start. So you already have things in place. So when the RFI or RFP drops, you're ready to go. You've been shaping it. You've been talking with the customer. You have your different avenues of uncertainty of what could happen, and it helps you prepare even in that uncertainty. So the earlier in the process, the higher levels of uncertainty, the more effective CI is, because that's what it's helping do, is limit that lens of uncertainty so you can understand and start to prepare for that contract opportunity. Or again, even in a commercial market, maybe you're looking at something that there really isn't a time frame. So maybe the earlier you start, the more effective that can be, and you can start building lessons learned, building best practices, and implementing them effectively. And so again, kind of the way we hit the nail on the head there is, you can buy a lot of things, you can invest, you can spend more money, but you can't buy the time back in order to do effective CI. And with that, we come in and, if you have the time, you have a strong culture of CI, communicate effectively. Like I said earlier, to me, communication is probably the most important aspect. You have to have the right stakeholders in the room. You have to have the right place, the right time, and the right people to make sure that this information is heard, that the intelligence is, again, actionable insights that people can understand and utilize. Because if the people there aren't invested and they're treating it as a check the box activity, that's the farthest your information will go. And whether that's right or wrong, right, that goes into making sure that your information is going to the right stakeholders, because you're trying to help your company, your organization, or whoever you're saddled up with from a CI perspective to help them improve their chances of winning a program or being more successful in a market. And so sometimes it is up to us as the analyst to make sure that we frame where that message is going and to the right audience. It could be that maybe it's, hey, it's on leadership to do that. But as a CI analyst, as a stakeholder in the process, we have to take it upon ourselves to say, hey, we've done this research, right? We need to make sure that this is heard to help improve the company or the organization's position. And part of what really helps that is kind of, we talked about it earlier with making sure intelligence is not information. We have to make sure that we're giving actionable insights, because anybody can go and read a couple of articles. Anyone can go and say, oh, hey, I saw this in the public domain, or I saw this contract announcement. What's tough is being able to communicate what that means. Why is this important to the company? Why does this matter? Why are they going to do this? Why should I pay attention to this information? And bringing in those insights is what can help you communicate effectively, because it's unfortunate, but if you're giving information, it is perfectly reasonable that a stakeholder could say, I could have gotten this anywhere. And right, it's unfortunate. Some of us have learned those lessons.
Crueler words ever been said.
Yeah. And so, right, we've been in that seat before. And so, right, once you get a taste of that, you realize, right, stakeholders have limited amount of time and they have highly critical decisions that they have to make. And so when you can really turn that information into crisp, clean insights and communicate those effectively, it really helps increase the buy-in from the stakeholders. They can see how it helps them. And so again, really focusing in on turning the information into insights. And sometimes it does come down to you as the analyst to make sure you have the right people in the right place at the right time to communicate.
Yeah, and that brings us to increasing your team's proficiency. So on the previous slide, we talked about what the best practices are. In the number one best practice, we talked about awareness, always be listening. Well, those things don't happen by accident, right? You don't walk in the door the first day and say, "Wow, I'm really effective at generating insights or communicating effectively or, being able to do the research and analysis and all of that." So, one of the things that you want to do is look at your team and say, "Hey, how do I equip everyone with the necessary skills and training and cycles of learning so that they can increase their proficiency?" And so the second bullet here that says find opportunities to increase cycles of learning, that's something that has to be intentional, right? That's intentional because the more we do this, and I'm not talking about just CI analysts, I'm talking about in general in an organization, the more we provide these opportunities for cycle of learning, the faster we come down the curve and increase our proficiency. Part of this is helping folks understand where do I find the data? How do I analyze the data? What are some of the techniques I can use, to leverage this data into relevant insights? The context matters, right? And so part of this, training and proficiency is going beyond believing everything you read, but understanding, okay, well, what does this mean? Where did this come from? How does this fit into that overall picture? Because when you're getting those breadcrumbs and you're trying to tie them all together, understanding that context is very helpful. The next one, focusing on what matters. So this is you saw that was one of the key attributes of a CI analyst, and now when you go up to the organizational level, it's the same thing. Uh, hey, a lot of businesses want to grow, especially folks who are looking at competitive intelligence. It means that there are threats to my business, right? I'm trying to keep people out of my market, or I'm trying to grow and enter somebody else's market, or plow new ground, right? And so when you think about that, just the word competitive, organizations can have a tendency to try and go after too much. And so what we see is in competitive intelligence, I want it, I want it, I want it. Wait, there's not a lot of time. I only have a limited number of resources dedicated to this. Well, if we can increase the team's proficiency, that's one way of helping with, the burden and the workload and balancing things out. But the other thing is prioritizing our efforts. Not everything is created equally. Can we find something that at a market level or a suite of opportunities or a product line level or something where we say, okay, if I'm looking at the same competitors over and over, or I'm looking at the same customers or whatever the technologies, how can I leverage that, right? Or, hey, what is most important? Okay, because in those areas that we get, and most important doesn't necessarily mean biggest. Most important is really defined in our context as which ones would deliver the most value, and value being defined higher probability of achieving my objective. Avoiding FOMO, fear of missing out. This is a huge misconception in CI. More data is better. We have plenty of objective evidence from all of the data analysis that we do, not just within our line of business, but within our entire corporation, that just proves this is not true. More data isn't always better. You need to find the right data. Look at the right quality of data. And then we talked about this as a best practice, or as a key attribute for a CI analyst, and that is know what you're looking for. So beyond an individual level, as an organization, what am I looking for? What type of intelligence? What are my objectives for my CI program, and how that's going to help me grow my business?
Yeah, and from there, the next thing that we talked about, and this kind of comes once you get the sufficient resources, leverage your team in the way that's best fit. So one, not everyone is going to be a quote unquote dedicated CI analyst, but everyone inside the organization, kind of the way we see it from a defense perspective, right? Everyone's a sensor, and we must all share our data effectively. So this may mean you're not the CI analyst, but if you're in business development and you're in sales and you're on a trade show floor, talking to customers, talking to competitors, that's information that should be shared to your competitive intelligence team or the capture team. So everyone has a role to play because we all have different connections and networks that are there. And what really becomes a way to create a larger CI team, even if it is an army of one, is leveraging that network that you have inside your organization, right? Everyone's talking to different customers about different programs, talking to different competitors that are at conferences. And so it really is learning how, again, building that strong culture, kind of going back to number one, if everyone's invested and understands that they play a role in this, you can really build up a much larger CI team or organization, even if you have limited dedicated CI analysts. And so it really does become important of how to leverage this network. And a lot of the times we'll find, even for some of our clients, where they're looking for a subject matter expert, and we tell them, hey, you just hired their former lead engineer and he's sitting in the office basically two hallways down, right? Sometimes the organizations, when we work at some of these larger companies, you don't know the own information that could be residing inside your own employees that you could leverage in the appropriate and ethical way to gain some of this insight without even having to look external. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, well, we live in an age, right, where everybody wants AI and data analytics, and I've got this gold mine of data, right? Everybody tells me there's value to this data. What can I do? And CI is no different, right? This is nothing new. Most companies are sitting on a gold mine of data. They just don't know what they have there, or maybe they don't want to put the effort to actually mine it out and all of that. And so, part of that culture of CI, this really goes into it, right? Is that effectively leveraging it? We're going to talk about tools down to number 11, but but it's a big concern, right? It's the untapped gold mine that companies have.
Yeah, and going along with kind of what Ricardo's mentioned with the gold mine, this comes into really setting realistic expectations. And right, when we talk about setting realistic expectations, if let's say someone watching this comes in and goes, ooh, I'm going to take this back to my organization, and tomorrow we're going to be fully dedicated to CI and we're going to harness all of this, it's not going to happen, right? The intention is there, but just like we said with starting early, you need to allow sufficient time for the analysis to be conducted and understand that CI is always going to have a level of uncertainty to it, a level of analysis that needs to be conducted and be built in with the appropriate timeframes. And bias is there. Whether this is, hey, we have a subject matter expert, and yet let's use Raytheon or Boeing, for example. If you're talking to someone who's a former Raytheon employee that's passed their conflict of interest checks, if they're saying and singing all the praises of how late and great Raytheon's newest technology is, it's not to say that they're wrong, but understanding, right, for 20 to 30 years, they have been taught and kind of, right, what we do is the best. We provide the best technology, we provide this. And so it's not that we're understanding that they're incorrect or not providing helpful information, but understanding that there's a bias, right? Same if that person was a former Boeing employee or a former government customer, everyone has a bias they're working through, even the analyst, when they're finding this information. And so understanding whether it's within your review process or the right stakeholders to verify and bring that information is really towards the goal of objectivity. And so if we can set those realistic expectations of who's contributing to the information, understanding that bias and giving the time to sort through that bias, it can really, really help kind of be a best practice going forward with the information that you're receiving. And I think, kind of going on to the next one, and I'll throw it over to Ricardo, the uncertainty is probably our favorite aspect of it in one way, but it is something that takes time to get comfortable with, and Ricardo will really expand on that one.
Yeah, we in CI live in the domain of the probabilistic and the uncertain, not the black and white deterministic. And this is where people struggle a lot, is being able to understand, well, how, I've got this thing that I think is unknowable. How do I figure that out, right? How do I handle that? Or it could be this, or it could be that. I don't know. And so, to us, part of, the CI best practices that we've seen are, number one, companies or organizations that really consider these alternatives and the impact of assumptions, right? We go in and say, okay, I've made this assumption. Well, does it even matter? Does it drive the outcome? And if it does, maybe I need to really spend some time there going into depth and understanding why I made that assumption, or where can I get, what I need, and taking that big question and breaking it down into little questions. So maybe I can't answer the big one, but if I could break it down, into smaller questions, maybe I can answer those and reduce my uncertainty. And the second one here, about embracing uncertainty is encourage risk taking. That sounds crazy because we tend to, find folks in our organizations who are risk averse, right? There's lots of dollars at stake and people's jobs and, and financial incentives and all kinds of stuff on the line. But encouraging risk taking really, goes back to that creative, inquisitive, open-minded culture of CI, right? Letting folks go out and, and try different things, look to other industries, maybe, look at some innovative or non-traditional ways of, of getting, to a solution, right? But in terms of embracing that uncertainty, it's just something that comes with time and with practice. But really looking at those assumptions is important. Now, number 9, not all organizations have this, and some that do struggle. But effectively leveraging a win-loss program to improve future outcomes. So if we go through and we are in pursuit of business, whether we win or lose, there's an opportunity there for a feedback loop, right? The first step in that feedback loop is after I have submitted a proposal or after I've met a certain milestone, let us sit down and do a lessons learned and figure out, okay, what worked or didn't work in the process? What are opportunities that we can improve in the process? That one has nothing to do with the outcome. That one's really looking at how can we do or get to the same place in a better way. Okay. The second part of that is really looking at the outcomes, right? Okay, so at this point in time, we were trying to predict the future. The future is now the past. How did it work? How did our assumptions work? How close did we get, right? Being very objectively critical on that can help us calibrate not just our quote unquote models, model being a knowledge framework, and all that, or our data, but it can really calibrate our culture, our mindset, our thinking. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've run into a lot of people who make a lot of assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions go unchecked or unvalidated. And they go one capture to the next, to the next, to the next, and they take that behavior with them. And so to me, part of this effective leveraging is 1, having it, but 2, consistently doing this win-loss analysis, having that feedback loop and saying, okay, how can we take a little bit more of a data-driven approach to help us improve the outcome, right? That's the goal, is not to go back and say, I told you so, or I gotcha, and I was right, and you were wrong. It's, ooh, yep, let's calibrate because we want to get better the next time and the next time. And that can be more difficult than that it seems. And then number 10, and I'll kick it to you for the last one, James.
Yeah, no worries.
So continuous monitoring and pre-position CI. One of the things that we've seen as a best practice is folks who can strategically use their resources to be able to, 1, scale, but 2, rapidly respond to those short-term requests. So for example, if I compete against the same 10 competitors, maybe I compete with them in different markets, but if I compete with them continuously, instead of, oh, I've got this opportunity, let me go look at them. Oh, I've got this other opportunity, let me go look at them. This is, okay, we're constantly scanning, analyzing, and tracking those movements over time, vice let me go and look at them all at once, because that takes time. But if you invest up front, it's easier to maintain and keep track of things than it is to just start from scratch. And then the pre-position CI, to me, when we think about how do we help increase the team's proficiency, how do we help leverage the team's strengths and start early and focus on what matters? Well, this pre-position CI, those are enablers for the non-CI professionals. I mean, they're enablers for the CI professional as well, but what they do is they give us a start. Oh, you know what? I'm new here. This is my first time looking at this competitor. Don't worry. That knowledge, that tribal knowledge, the corporate memory, here it is right here. We keep it up to date. It's ready to go so that when somebody needs it, they can access it and they can leverage that. Again, it saves time. Some of the knowledge, that again, that corporate memory, that can get passed down in a very consistent manner, from person to person, uh, depending on how you set that up. And that brings us really to the bookend here, number 11, James. So why don't you go into that one?
Yeah, and number 11 can really make or break an effective competitive intelligence group inside of an organization, because this is where we really see, in simpler terms, where people put their money where their mouth is. If CI is important to your organization and you guys are looking to improve how you compete against your competitors in a given market space, you need to invest properly in the right qualified resources in order to be effective. So, right, this is a combination of people, tools, and incentives inside of your organization, because even if we have people, we can buy all the CI tools in the world and subscriptions to all the best databases that are there, but just because they exist and just because we have them doesn't mean that we're going to utilize them or even utilize them properly. If we don't have the right people and the right training of how to harness what's in those databases or tool sets that we may be building, it needs to be built into the process and understood. And right, this does reflect upon, going always back to number one, the culture inside the organization. And there is a balance of internal and external resources, right? Depending on how much money the company has to dedicate towards CI. One, an internal CI analyst is always great to have, but sometimes there is an external perspective that is needed as well. Maybe the internal CI analyst can't cover all the opportunities, or maybe there's an opportunity that's so important that you need almost a litmus test or a third-party perspective to make sure, hey, I trust my internal CI analyst, but I also need a third party, because if we miss the mark on this, right, this is a must-win, critical to our business. And again, that's where, if we look at this as an open-minded mindset in that culture versus a gotcha game, the external and internal team can work together really well while remaining independent and unbiased from each other. And from there, developing a pipeline, this is something that we've always, I would say, struggled with in a good way. Finding qualified, strong competitive intelligence analysts doesn't happen overnight. Even some of our best analysts here at Lone Star still, once they start, take time to develop and grow. And so developing a pipeline, whether, right, once you get the organization set up, there's universities such as Mercyhurst, which specializes in competitive intelligence programs that could be reached out to for qualified candidates. This could be internship opportunities. This could be a training program where you start to bring people slowly into CI and have maybe some different levels of certification to know, hey, your day job isn't CI, but there is a role that you play. And then, right, maybe they transition into that role later on. So there's a lot of ways, but it's always better to start developing a pipeline so that you have qualified people who understand your business, understand the organization's intent, that move into this role.
Something about that, James, that we see a lot, right? Especially with large companies. There might be folks who don't want to be a professional CI analyst for the rest of their career, right? But part of that pipeline is, hey, if I'm going to increase the team's proficiency, this might be a critical step as an organizational philosophy of, hey, anyone who's going into capture or BD or something, hey, they need to spend some time learning and perfecting the CI craft, right? It's something that, part of that pipeline isn't just the full-time analyst. It's building the pipeline of capability across the organization. Again, that's a best practice that we have seen, and it pays dividends. It takes some time to get there, but definitely pays dividends.
Absolutely. And the last piece there, really, we've kind of covered it, but it's not just having the tools, it's making sure that everyone's trained and able to effectively leverage those tools, in terms of getting the analysis, disseminating the information, getting it to the key stakeholders. Because you can pay a ton for subscription services and the latest, greatest tool from whichever software company claims to have broken, competitive intelligence from an AI perspective. But if you're not effectively leveraging them, then that money is essentially going down the drain. And so making sure that they're utilized the correct way is important, so that those resources are improving your business case and your mindset.
Yeah, I think that's a real critical, thing to just hammer home, and that is the right tool for the right job. There are a lot of these tools out there. I tell you what, I've researched a ton of these. Um, you know, every tool has its merits and its strengths and weaknesses and all that kind of stuff. But being able to find something, an implementation that helps you for your organization, it can save you a lot of time. It can save on the research time. Some of them can do curation, right? James mentioned AI, ML. Some are better than others, but being able to, you know, filter out the type of data that you're looking for. Some of them can do some cursory analysis, but most of that is going to be done, by an analyst and then disseminating, right? How do I communicate this? Where can people go get it or input it and things like that? There's plenty of case studies out there of organizations who have, large organizations who have done this effectively. So, with that, we're at the end of our time for this particular webinar. But before we go, um, wanted to, just leave you with this. I believe we're going to publish this this webinar, but if you are ever in need of those third-party services, that's what we do here, and we also offer some professional software to do that data analysis should you ever need it. So, with that being said, we really appreciate the time and the attention today. And, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. My email is rlopez@lone-star.com, and James is jrudlinger@lone-star.com. I'll go to the last slide here. This is how you can get a hold of us by phone or email. And if you just want to talk, we're not a law firm. We're not going to charge you by the hour if you have questions or want to, talk shop or anything like that. Feel free to reach out to us. And with that being said, we really appreciate the time and hope that you took something away from this that'd be of value.